Hey, how's it going? I'm gonna move this over here just to be different, keep things fresh. Um, yeah, what a beautiful start to the summer in terms of weather and the sun and being with all of you this morning. What a gift, really. I've got a lot of ground to cover today, so no small talk, no jokes. Look at your bulletin thingy, the white thing. And you'll see on the back side the map. This is now the fourth installment of the map in terms of my contribution. I want to talk about this. What is this map? I want to return to it again today. And in some ways, we're beginning to close out the year even. We thought we'd do an experiment at C3 this year, which was to have a single theme for the entire year, Terra. And what would it look like just to keep returning to it? And that's what we're doing again today, using this particular map. And the summer will be closing the door on that particular theme. And you might want to begin to ask yourself, did I learn anything this year? Was I inspired by anything this year? Was I challenged by anything this year? Does the world look different at the end of a full year of just returning to it week after week after week? I mean, the way you see the world, do you see it any differently? Does do the tasks at hand seem more urgent or less? Does our relationship with the earth call to you more or less at the end of this year? Those are things I think worth thinking about. Otherwise, I've been giving sermons a long time, and I've learned, not you all, I would never accuse you, but most of the time be like, oh, that was interesting, and then boom, it's gone. You know, very rarely will something stick. But the way to make it stick is for you and me to ask questions like, what did I learn? What was I inspired to do or be, or what's being pulled out from my own depths with this conversation with the earth? So anyway, those are some things worth thinking about. So let me do a quick review of where we've been so far and what this map is, and then we'll dig into one particular element of it. It might take me a couple of weeks to do so. So this might be just part one of a two-part conversation. So Bill Plotkin, one of my teachers, he's a psychotherapist and or a depth psychologist, although on the back of his books it will say that he's a psychotherapist gone wild. Okay? He doesn't practice psychotherapy anymore, not in any formal sense. He has been started an organization called Animas Valley Institute in Colorado, and he, along with many other guides, men and women, lead retreats and programs in really wild places around the United States and now the world, including New Zealand and Australia and Croatia and England and Ireland and Germany, and the places are growing in terms of where these programs are being held. And they have two components to them, and I won't sort of give you, everything I won't try to do. I'm just doing a drive-through version of some of his work. It has two dimensions. One is connected to a conversation about wholeness, and that is in the book Wild Mind, which is the map that you're looking at. The map you're looking at is a way of talking about our innate human wholeness. And would you agree that even if we didn't really define the word very well, would you agree that you need more wholeness in your life? Or your family would benefit from a little more wholeness? Or our culture, society, not the government, that's perfect as it is, but yes, so a conversation about what is wholeness and how do we say yes to that conversation is the book Wild Mind, and some of the programs are oriented around that. One unique element about them is that they're nature-based. There's a belief that deeper communion and conversation with nature helps us become more whole as human beings. And that's not just his idea. This is an idea that's it's as ancient as we have. It's as ancient as the human story, for one thing, but also is pretty broadly accepted in psychological and therapeutic circles. That's one element of the work. The other work is soul-oriented work. which is scary as hell, which is the descent to soul, or in other terms, the life cycle, the death of the ego, the dark night of the soul, the hero's journey. All of those refer to what happens when the ego begins to lose its grip on who it thinks it is in the world and you descend. That's the other part of Bill Plotkin's work. That is other kinds of programs. They're related because, as you probably know, when your world unravels and who you thought you were in the world unravels, it's best to have some wholeness with you on that perilous journey. Would you agree? Otherwise, you're going to be in serious trouble. So they're related conversations. This is just like a quick drive-through to his work. Now, concerning the book Wild Mind. The book Wild Mind uses the 4 cardinal directions, which we've been looking at. And the question is why? Because the 4 cardinal directions, north, south, east, west, show up in just about every culture and religion and spirituality that you can think of. Number 1, because it's a way that human beings came to understand the natural world or orient themselves to the natural world through the 4 directions. But also because those 4 directions tend to mirror something back to us of our own capacities. In other words, who we are in our own wholeness. So there's a conversation between the 4 directions and who we are from a psychological point of view. Or really, I mean more of the psyche. What is the psyche? And I'll say more about that in a second. So that's one contribution of the book. The other is this, and this is a quote from James Hillman, also a depth psychologist. He said, 100 years of psychotherapy and we're sicker than ever. Okay? And he goes on to say what he means by that. What he means is that the way psychology got started was problem-focused, which makes sense. Just like medicine got started that way. Identify the problem and identify the cure for the problem and go after it with all your resources. That's how psychology got started, because psychology and medicine were holding hands. And there's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes you need very specific help for a very specific problem, correct? Unless you're lying to me, okay? You probably have bumped into this. I have a problem with X and I need to get some help with it. That's what psychotherapy, psychology, counseling is often good for. However, there's been less conversation about what does it mean to be psychologically whole. And I don't mean perfect by any stretch of the imagination. I just mean more well-rounded, more balanced, more access to more resources. When all of your energy is going toward the problem, you tend to forget a whole vast field out in front of you. I'll give you a good example. Sometimes, let's say you're talking to a friend, and your friend is telling you about some magic new pill that they are now taking. All right? It could be, some algae. It could be some, psychoactive agent. It could be something the doctor prescribed. Doesn't matter. Your friend is telling you about this pill. And the way that your friend is talking about it, not that you would ever do this, but the way the friend is talking about it is that if I take this, this is going to fix my problem. Correct? And one part of you thinks, maybe, but probably not. Because if you were to take a look at your entire life, you might want to get your finances in order, start exercising, change your diet, walk more than 25 steps a day, and so forth. That you could think of 100 things that would really obviously benefit your friend, of which the pill could be one component. Am I making sense? That's a conversation about a holistic approach. Okay, so I needed to say just a little bit of background before I get to the map. Because when we look at the map, it's a way, a model, a map of talking about wholeness. What does it look like for us to grow into our innate capacities as human beings that are buried in the psyche? And how can we do that holistically? Forget about your individual problems. Okay? Sort of, I mean that. But forget about that as being the magic pill or the magic bullet that's going to fix your life. This model says, let's take a look at our innate capacities and try to grow into them and cultivate them. And in turn, that will help us create a better conversation with our unique individual problems. Have I made sense? All right. So, wow, that was a long intro. And I'm not done, okay? I love intros. I could do just weeks that were only introducing things. All right. Now, the ground that we've covered so far, we've talked about the West, the North, and the East. We've talked about them both as they appear in nature. In other words, we'll do that in a few minutes when we talk about the South, but I said things like, what comes to mind when I say North? Or what comes to mind when I say West? Or what? And that created a kind of dialogue and conversation. It turns out there was a lot of uniformity in the kinds of things we were talking about. And then we talked about psychological archetypes that are associated with these dimensions. So when we were in the West, we talked about the muse, or the beloved, the guide to soul. The West facet of your own wholeness that's buried in there is your inner poet, the one that turns everything into symbol, that sees metaphorically, that's in love with death and the life-death-life cycle, and it's connected with the fall. Don't you get that magic feeling in the fall when the leaves begin to fall and you're just like, oh, what is this? And the air turns crisp. That's the West facet, and suddenly you're a poet. Okay? That's the West facet of wholeness, and everybody has it. Doesn't matter about ethnicity or gender or religion or no religion, okay? Then we talked about the North. In the North, the archetype in the North was the nurturing, generative adult. Buried within you is both the capacity to be nurturing and generative. It's the archetypal parent in you, whether you have kids or not. And would you say that our world needs more nurturing, generative people? Yes. So what does it look like to cultivate that? That nurturing, generative adult is going to ask questions like, how does this affect the next 7 generations? That's that inner elder in you that can be cultivated and nurtured, that you need just in the difficulties of life. So that's the North. Then we talked about the East, and the East facet of wholeness, the archetype was the innocent sage. The innocent sage is that part of us that is humorous, childlike, like the Dalai Lama, and also full of wisdom. It's the inner pope that says, how many people work at the Vatican? He says, I say about half of them. Okay? That's that combination of wisdom and lightness, and you need that, and you can cultivate that. It's part of our innate human capacities, and the East, as the sun rises, helps bring some of that forth. It's the long vision of things. It's the feeling you have when you get up in the morning and you can see the whole day and you wonder, what are the possibilities? As the polar opposite of the West, when the sun is going down and things are going dark. It's a very different feeling. Anyway, I don't need to redo them all. But I wanted to just remind you of where the ground that we've covered and sort of the archetypal images associated with them. Okay? Now we come to the South. All right, now we come to the South. Now, first of all, little audience participation here. What comes to mind when I say South? Hot, warmth, sun, grits, okay? Corn. We could go even deeper than just grits. What else? Music? Green, yes. Hurricanes. Oh, man, I love a good hurricane. Don't you? I mean, seriously, I don't always love that people die, but just like, what is this thing? You know? That just came out of the ocean. Out of the South, raging. Oh, man. I just got excited about hurricanes. Okay. What else comes to mind with South? New Orleans, all right? And what about New Orleans? Let's go further. Jazz, okay? Food, party, indulgence, overindulgence, donuts, the beach, Yes, hot. How about, let's say you're going to put solar panels on your roof. What direction do you want them to face? Okay. What if you have a bunch of hillsides and you want to plant gardens? What hillside are you going to choose? The south-facing hillsides. Okay. Obviously, this gets reversed in our neighbors to the south, further south. It's true. I mean, if we were to do the same set of questions for those who were indigenous to that area of the world, they would be saying the same thing but opposite. Isn't that interesting? So anyway, yes, these are the elements of that come to mind when we think of South. The archetype that Bill Plotkin associates with the South is the wild indigenous one. Okay, as we're going around the wheel, the wild indigenous one. And let me be just as straightforward as I can. Buried in you, and especially for Westerners, and especially for polite Westerners, buried deeply in there is a wild indigenous one. Someone who is at home on the earth. That's what indigenous means. Their home territory is earth, is terra, and is more specifically the actual ground that they inhabit and live in, their bioregion, is at home under the stars and paddling out on the bayou and drinking out of a stream if you can wipe away the PFAS layer, okay? Something in you, that's the wild indigenous one. Everybody has it. Why? Because you are nature. Have you ever seen a little kid just running around in the woods? If you can resist saying, be careful, you can see the wild indigenous one on full display. Put shoes on, we might say, but not to the kid. Their feet are just their feet. They're made of nature. They're on the earth. Who needs shoes? I can't tell you how many socks my children have ruined by running around in socks, you know? You don't need that insulated layer between you and the earth. That's the wild indigenous one who likes to walk around barefoot and loves a good hurricane. He wants to lean into. One time I was in, sometimes new with hurricanes, but I was in Petra. You know where Petra is in Jordan? Or you've at least seen Indiana Jones in The Last Crusade where they come up on this thing, cave-like structure. But anyway, I was at Petra when I was in graduate school, and the wind happened to be blowing like 60, 70 miles an hour. So we thought, what a great idea to go up on top of these bluffs and lean into it. Because there were these like fallen down temples at the very top of all this stuff. So that's what we did. That's a very South, wild, indigenous one thing to do. How far can you lean into the wind before you have to like take a step forward? That's that childlike, wild self. And that's part of who you are. And part of what gets suppressed in our prudish culture, we could say. Okay, so other archetypes, I'll just list a few. Archetypes from literature. So you have the green man or the green woman. Sometimes you'll see this in myths and stories. They tend to come up out of the swamp. They might be covered in vines. They might have tree branches in their hair. That's the green man, the green woman. Other ones are Artemis. Artemis is a very good South archetype. Artemis is interesting. Like she sort of morphs as she moves around the Mediterranean. But Artemis is both a huntress and the protector of small animals, which is kind of a funny combo. You certainly don't want to mess with her. She's of nature. She's perfectly at home out in the wild world, wandering around. So Artemis is someone that comes to mind. Fertility, birth, rebirth, all South-oriented elements of these archetypes. Nymphs, Puck in Midsummer Night's Dream. Puck is 100% South. Okay, Peter Pan, very South-like. Although he tends to be a bit of an eternal boy and needs to grow up, but definitely at home in the wild world, correct? Flying around, doing things, playing. We say, quit playing, I don't know why that ever became good advice. But nevertheless, that's the South dimension. Okay, what else? Let's talk a bit about the word indigenous. Because thankfully, it's now being used to talk about native people, indigenous people. But let's talk about sort of what it means more specifically. And I would say there are three elements that to keep in mind. So if someone is indigenous, oftentimes they're very rooted in a particular culture. That's partly how we use the word indigenous. And that culture is fairly stable and pretty well defined. Like, think about native cultures, native religions, indigenous religions, and indigenous cultures. What makes up the family unit and culture is pretty set. Okay? But the other component of indigenous is that it's rooted in a particular place and usually not so mobile, although that's not always the case, but rooted in particular landscapes, rivers, mountains, valleys, as being home. So the indigenous element is the one that feels at home in a particular place. That's why if you talk to indigenous people from the United States, they say that mountain is sacred. They don't say mountains are sacred. They might think that abstractly. They say that is called Sleeping Ute Mountain, and that is our grandmother or grandfather, depending on who you ask. Meaning, is the mountain male or female? They don't mean anything abstract by that. They mean this place is sacred to us and to our family and to our ancestors. Same with rivers. This particular river. There was a time before the Grand River was called the Grand River, I guarantee you, was a sacred river to a particular people who were rooted in this place. Correct? The grandness of it came from their intimate involvement in its own life cycle. Meaning they ate from it, they drank from it, they washed in it. It was part of who they were. There was less separation between their own humanness and the water itself. That's true of most ancient people. Am I making sense? So tends to be grounded in culture, tends to be rooted in a particular place. And what was the third element? Good thing I made notes. I think the broadest way of thinking about the word indigenous is that our ultimate home is terrestrial, if we want to put it that way, in the largest possible sense. We are part of the earth. We could even go further than that and say we are part of the cosmos. So from culture to a particular place to the earth itself, to the cosmos. And actually now in the 21st century, because of the scientific enlightenment, we now think about the universe in much bigger terms than any of our ancestors ever dreamed of. And we're a part of that. The Bible says, from dust you came, to dust you shall return. That's incredible. I mean, I don't know how Western Christianity ever said, well, we're just kidding. The point, we're just going to live forever in the sky. No, the first thing they're told is you are made of dust and you're going to die. How's that for an opening chapter? Okay. But anyway, we now know from a scientific point of view, that's actually the case. We're made of particles. We're made of earth. Some of the particles in your body were here before you were. And they will survive after you. That is absolutely mind-blowing. We are part of the earth, part of the cosmos. Have I made sense? Okay. Question is, what do we do now? What about this wild indigenous one? All I'm saying is part of your own psyche, deep within there, knows that you are part of the earth, part of the cosmos. And part of the return to your own self facet of wholeness is to walk toward that. Walk toward your own dust-like nature, to walk barefoot on the earth, to feel your mortality and the dustness of your life, and to revel and play. That's very south-faceted. And if we don't recover a sense of our wild indigenous one, that we belong here on this earth, and we could say right now we belong here in this bioregion, and the toilets that we flush affect that river right out there. Am I pointing in the right direction? Okay? Then we will continue to live in this willfully blind, industrialized, abstract world that's not working, that has become essentially a suicidal culture. The wild indigenous one, like a kid, wants to hold our hand and take us back to a deeper connection with all things. Have I made sense? All right. So, next element. The window of knowing. One of the things that, if you look again at your map, north, south, east, west, each of those has a particular, what Bill Plotkin calls window of knowing or primary orientation. Let's see, north is thinking. East is senses. You're sensing self. West is, what is west? Doesn't matter, I'm going to let it go right now. South is emotions. Okay? South is feeling. Feeling feelings. And actually, feeling feelings feels very alive, whether you like the feeling or not. Correct? Like, think about that, when you first started falling in love with anything or anyone, that sort of vibrating madness that takes over your entire body. It's not like you woke up and thought, you know what I'm going to practice today? I'm going to practice my feeling sense, and I'll try it out with this person. It just comes out of the blue, and it makes us feel very alive. Same with also so-called negative emotions. Have you ever really, really grieved, and your body has been heaving, and afterwards, your body felt good in some way? It felt alive. Not that you were happy. That's not talking about happiness. I'm talking about the capacity for full feelings. That's the South. The South loves, the wild indigenous one loves to feel anything at all. I'll give you some examples of how to, I'll give you some examples of how to talk about such feelings, which is kind of a strange way of going at it. Take anger, for example, okay? Or being mad. Now, I know, like, I grew up in a Christian culture, and actually, in my household, the number one enemy was anger. Like, you weren't allowed to be angry, because a good Christian wouldn't be angry, okay? Which means, of course, none of us were angry, right? No, which means it all went into the basement, and then just, boiled in a pot until it, exploded, all right? Anyway, so anger. So in a holistic way, let's talk about it from a holistic point of view, first of all. What would it serve? Here are questions when you begin to feel anger that are connected with questions of wholeness. Listen to these. How do I deserve to be treated? Let's say I'm feeling angry. A question like, well, how do I deserve to be treated? Or how do others deserve to be treated? Or what's wrong with the world? Or should the world be different than the way I'm imagining it? These are gifts that when you are in contact with your feeling self, these are the gifts that can come if you'll allow yourself to feel such things. Here's another one that no one likes to do when they're very angry and when they're feeling angry. Am I a part of the problem? I know most of the time when you're angry, you're definitely not part of the problem. It's definitely somebody else. But to allow yourself to feel all the way through that thing is to get to some of those deeper questions. Let's try it out with sadness. Let's say sadness or grief. Let's say you're feeling some sadness. Here are questions. What do I love and value? What do I love and value then? If I feel sad because this, and this happened, well, what do I love and value? How would I like to see the world? What have I lost? part of sadness. Well, what have I lost? And to contemplate that and revel in that. I lost something and it hurts. What am I afraid to lose is another good question. And maybe beneath that are, what are my real desires? See, someone who's really cultivating the wild indigenous one, who is much more at home in their feeling sense, is able to get to questions like that. Emotions then serve us rather than they are the problem. Okay? Here's another one. How about guilt or shame? You're never supposed to say anything positive about shame, all right? Here are questions that might be associated when you feel these feelings, like, well, what is expected of me? Or here's a deeper one. What do I expect of myself? Suddenly I feel guilty or slightly ashamed. What do I expect of myself? What are my values? Have I violated my values, or has someone else violated my values? The wild indigenous one, who's able to feel from a place of wholeness, is also able to ask these more difficult questions. I'll do two more. What about joy? All right, joy. Let's just say one time you go out there on Lake Michigan and you're sitting there and you close your eyes and you feel the sun on your skin and you feel happy. Right? Has that ever happened to you? Accidentally. You're like, I just came out, and all of a sudden you just feel happy. Where does that go? Well, to sink into such feelings, what kind of questions might you then ask? What makes my life better? What makes the world better? One answer to that could be the freaking sunshine. The wild indigenous one knows this. It's not an abstract philosophical concept. If I could just, it's the sun. Feel the feeling of the sun on my skin. Not anything about, well, you have to understand the vitamin D this and it gets absorbed. Forget about that. Just the feeling of it. What makes me happy? What makes my life better? What do I rejoice in? What needs to be rejoiced in? How can I live my life more joyfully? The wild indigenous one loves these kinds of questions. I'll leave it at that. That's just a way of beginning to talk about this window of knowing, which is emotions, that come through the wild indigenous one. So let me talk about two other aspects of that. Another dimension of the wild indigenous one is what we might call eros. Eros is where we get words like erotic. It's the fire of life, the passion of life. It is sexual at times, but maybe bigger than that, it's sensual. It's the sensual aspect of our own wholeness. The vitality, the vibrancy, the eros that can cut through, that makes you feel alive. Like, think about Cupid's arrow, Again, you're not rationally deciding these things. Cupid just runs straight through your heart. And that can sometimes be in interpersonally. You might fall in love with someone, or the eros, the fire of eros might come through with a relationship. But believe it or not, it can happen with clouds and mountains and rivers and otters. The same kind of sensuous eroticism is everywhere. And the wild indigenous one knows it. That's that part of us that can say yes and begin a love affair with the earth itself. I know that sounds like a bit crazy, but it's only crazy because the most repressed element of these four directions in Western culture is the self. It's what we're afraid of. It's why when teenagers get to adolescence in the 6th grade, we separate the boys and girls and we try to contain all that energy. I'm talking about sex ed right now, okay? We're going to talk to the boys over here. We're going to talk to the girls over here. It's like the fire of adolescence is in full display. And I remember this as teaching high school. And I'm not against barriers and borders and rules and explaining things to kids. I mean, what I'm saying is, as a culture, though, We are very afraid of eros because it's like a fire. The worst example of that are the Puritans. If we can contain that and contain that and contain that and suppress it and suppress it and suppress it, we'll be okay and clean and pure as a culture. You know what that ends up resulting in? Burning witches. That's where it goes. It leaks out sideways in the culture. The wild indigenous one is at home. But what we need is not more sexuality. We need broader definitions of sexuality. We need bigger containers for eros, not just hyper focused on, maybe this is for a different generation, but swiping on your phone, you know, who I like and who I don't, who I can hook up with and who I don't. But it's such a narrow definition of eros. What about the earth itself? Have I made sense? Okay, like I said, this is going to have to be a couple part teaching because now I'm about 25% done. What do I want to do here? Let's talk about homework. Okay, I'm going to suggest that the only way to find out more about your own innate capacities, your nurturing generative adult, your muse beloved, your innocent sage, and now, specifically, your wild indigenous one, is to put it into practice. Is to go find out what this wild indigenous one is and how he or she wants to be in the world. The only way to find out about it is to cultivate it, is to say yes to it. So I've got some homework assignments, okay? And they're all very erotic, so get ready. Here's one. I want to encourage you to go on a wild south walk this week, all right? It's best if you go to a semi-wild place where you won't be disturbed. But you can do it in your yard, but your neighbors are going to think you're even more crazy than they already do, all right? But in a wild or semi-wild place, walk out onto the land and ask yourself this question. How does my wild indigenous one want to move on the land? And go very slowly until you can feel into that. Maybe your wild indigenous one might want to take her shoes off. Maybe your wild indigenous one might want to climb a tree, even though that seems like a bad idea. Maybe your wild indigenous one wants to get in really cold water. Who knows? But what if you said yes and followed your own instinctual body self where he or she wanted to go out onto the land? Have I made sense? That's only part one of the exercise. Part two is try to allow yourself to feel whatever it is that you're feeling. Some of you, this is going to be pretty easy. Others of you, this is going to be very hard. Because like I said, this is very suppressed in our culture. We don't know what we feel very often. So as you move out on your wild wander, what am I actually feeling? And where am I feeling it? You might be surprised. Sadness might come up. Fear might come up. Joy might come up. Let yourself say yes to that. Even asking questions like, and where do I feel that in my body? And to let it have its way. That's to cultivate a bit of the wild indigenous one. Skipping, I'm going to give you a whole list of things that are south-oriented, and then I'm done. Skipping, okay? Maybe you can't skip all that well, I don't know. Who cares? All right? Getting a massage. Yes, I told you can get a massage this week. Running. Yesterday, I was on a bike ride with my kids, and I decided to race my son up a hill. That's very wild indigenous one. And it was dumb when I got to the top. But I felt alive, That's saying yes to that. Swimming, sunbathing, drumming, yoga, singing, dancing. Singing in public places loudly, very good idea, okay? Very wild indigenous one, especially during the musical fountain. If you're singing another song, highly recommended. And here's the final one. If you can lower your sense of who you think you are in the world, your ego, and begin to have wild and imaginative conversations with trees and flowers and plants and bodies of water and stars and moon phases. And I mean actual, out loud, living conversations. That's the wild indigenous one, very at home. So those are your homework assignments. Wild walk, wild conversations, and any list of unusual activities that are body oriented. All right? Thanks for listening.